Yeah, yeah, and I think you should. Yeah, just so.
So we have in the country a lot of musicians, but very few composers and very few teachers who give lessons for composition or production. You would be happy to know about the structure in UK, how it is structured and was made, and how it's possibility to start to produce our own music. If you are young or it doesn't important is that which chances you have if you start the wish to become composer.
Yeah. Well, it's there's a kind of traditional model in the UK which won't surprise anybody, which is amongst the kind of pop music end of the world, which I include electronic music and anything else. There's a kind of tradition where people taught themselves, and there's communities that effectively enable the next generation to come up through, which is different to the compositional structures, which are, you'll be familiar with, which are much more based in academies and universities. And what's been happening recently is there's been a convergence of some of those structures. So when I was learning how to play guitar and DJing or anything else, I did it I grew up in London. I was surrounded by local pubs that in those days were the main venues. Obviously there's the big venues and the established acts, but for most people, the pubs were the places where you took in music, and then the beginnings of club culture. So I'd as a young kid who was much too young to be allowed to go into a pub and drink beer, used to go in the pub and drink beer and watch musicians, and I was lucky enough to be sort of taken under the wing of one particular guy who used to go and watch. He was actually a pianist, wanted to be a guitarist, but I was kind of fascinated by him. And so by the time I got to being able to gig, he was kind of there to sort of help me and introduce me to people on the circuit. And by the time I was 15, I had a residency in one of the sort of quite established London venues, and that kind of network obviously still exists, but it's I think probably less strong now, and that's partly because people have other options. You can look at YouTube, you can find out stuff online that wasn't available to earlier generations. But the other thing that's happened is that university courses and the classical music world have begun to get much more involved in teaching things like electronic music production, and there's now several universities. I actually wrote a list earlier on because my memory's not good enough to remember them all. But amongst the kind of the leading players for a while, there's been places like Guildhall and City University that have backgrounds in traditional classical music, and people who've joined to become classical musicians or composers, but who, while at university, have discovered electronic music and ended up being electronic producers, one of whom is a guy called M.J. Cole, who was one of the kind of big garage producers back in the late 90s and 2000s. He's still a big producer now, but he was at Guildhall studying classical music and began to get more interested in electronic music, and before he'd finished the course he was an established producer. There's a guy called Jules Buckley, who recently is most famous for having partnered with Pete Tong, the Radio 1 DJ, to do an album of classic house music orchestrated for a classical orchestra, which went to #1, phenomenally successful. But he's been doing stuff for the last 15 years. Again, he was at thank you very much. He was at Guildhall as well. So and began out. I think he was supposed to be a trumpet player originally, but now he's working with all kinds of people. Producing electronic music or kind of convergence between classical and electronic music. And there's places, there's Manchester, there's York has a long tradition in doing electronic music. This is where I have to look at my notes. Leeds, Salford, Lamb, the main producer in Lamb, went to Salford. and Brighton has had a increasingly active electronic production course. And then there are places like Southampton Solent that not only does music production, but has a former journalist called Martin James, who's a professor of music journalism there. And he's got a course that teaches sort of music and media, but also a whole package of things that kind of gets you into the realm of music. And I suppose the thing about all these, they're university courses, so they're 3-year courses. They're open to anybody to apply from throughout the world, so anybody can go there. You have to pay fees. The fees are more expensive if you come from overseas, so there are kind of issues around financing it. But they give you a kind of accredited degree. They also give you a structure which enables you to get into a community of other music-minded people, and they'll obviously give you introductions into the industry. So that's the kind of more established end of it. Most of those universities also do shorter courses, so you could look them up, and see whether there's short courses you can do on particular components of production. There are also, outside of that, a growing number of electronic music production and DJ training schools, most famous of which is Point Blank in London, but there are several now across the country, in Manchester, Brighton, and so on. And again, they offer shorter courses often. They're more flexible. Again, you have to pay fees to do them, but they also give you a community and an introduction into the music industry, and obviously the skills to produce. Outside of that, there's the traditional ways of sort of getting yourself into a studio and learning production on the job. Although, of course, there are fewer studios now, so that's a more difficult course. But the plus side is that it's easier to produce at home now, and it's easier to learn production. And of course, the difference between now and 20 years ago, or now and even 10 years ago, is that you can go into a shop and buy a relatively inexpensive package, or you can download a relatively inexpensive package, and have a full studio in your bedroom that previously would have been impossible without spending an awful lot of money, and spending many years learning how to use the equipment, and now it's much more intuitive. But the downside of that is that it lacks the community aspect to it, and with music it's a very people-based thing, so you always need the community to go with it. So you can be an excellent bedroom producer, but without getting the stuff out of the bedroom, it's not really much use to you. So the courses not only give you a quick route into expertise, but they also give you a kind of a wider support structure. And that, again, you can look at different places across, if you want to study in the UK, which will have different benefits. There's a course, for instance, in somewhere like Cornwall, which has got quite a different kind of music scene to somewhere like Manchester. So you probably want to bear those kind of things in mind when you're looking at where you want to study, because the different locations will give you different benefits. And that's probably all I can tell you. I'm not an expert on on education in music, and I totally taught myself and everything. So I can't recommend a course or anything like that. But there is a lot more available now than there used to be, and at different levels, so you can choose the way that you want to go in. Next question. Point Blank is the most established of the private independent courses, yeah, and I mean they do DJ production as well and all sorts.
You can reach it from
Yes, yeah. Yeah, that's true. Any other questions on that? Or? Okay. So
now you can introduce your exhibition, or space for your own program.
Oh, okay. Well, let's. I think probably I'm not so fussed about doing stuff on the book. I don't think there's that. You know, the book is there. It exists. So the question was on the state of music communities and music culture now in the UK, and I think what's happened over the last sort of couple of decades is that the strength of identity between music and youth culture in particular has become much weaker, and there, so there was a stage where people identified with a particular form of music, and that informed a whole approach to the way that they sort of went about their life, as long as the way that they dressed and various life choices. So it's a very sort of strong, sort of almost philosophical, cultural attachment, and I think that it still exists in certain forms of music, but it's less strong than it was, say, in the 70s or 80s. In fact, I think the last really strong cultural broad youth movement probably in the UK happened with acid house, which is not to say there aren't still aspects of culture. There are, there are people that choose sort of certain particular forms of, say, rock music or hip hop, or who live their lives according to that form of music. But as a kind of broader mass kind of phenomena, it's less strong than it was. And the causes for that are sort of quite general, but also it's probably not unrelated to the growth of the way that people consume their music online, and that people are exposed to a much broader spectrum of music. They have ways of accessing that music personally that before wasn't available. So it's easy to go on to streaming service and listen to loads of different forms of music without having to go to somebody else for recommendations and so on. So that's changed. I think the growth of festivals has, in the UK particularly, has reflected that. So for people who are used to hearing lots of different forms of music, choosing to go to a festival probably makes more sense than going to see somebody play at a particular venue or a particular club, which isn't to say none of that exists, because of course all of that stuff does still exist. But I think that people are more exposed to a broader range of genres and they have broader tastes, and that has an effect on the way that youth culture has kind of mutated. All of that said, music within the music community, those who make music, I don't think has changed that much, because musicians have always tended to have a broader set of influences than one genre. So although somebody might be immersed as a musician in a particular genre, the chances are they probably know musicians that play in other genres, and they probably participate in other genres. So I think there's still a strong music community. I think the issues for the music community are ones that face the whole industry. And as I said earlier, I think that's a much bigger and more complex question than what's happening within music cultures. But I think what's happening in the UK is not different to what's happening elsewhere. I think maybe a difference is that the UK traditionally has adopted and led the way on music cultures. And I don't see that so much there. Like certainly with dance culture and acid house, we took in something that had in that incarnation being developed in America and became a kind of a national passion for a certain generation. And I don't think anything like that really has happened since then. So it might be that type of culture in the UK has gone. And perhaps it's replaced by people having a more general kind of outlook on music as a kind of mass culture, and then a lot of niche cultures who passionately support their particular area. But I think even within those niche cultures, it's not that kind of, you don't get the fights between the mods and the rockers in the way that you used to. That kind of clash between youth cultures seems to have disappeared, and that's probably no bad thing. So yeah, I started Noise of Art about 12 years ago, after a kind of 3-year period of organising it in partnership with the Tate Gallery in London and the British Film Institute, and a place called Delaware Pavilion on the south coast of Britain. And the idea was that back then there were a lot of people making music and art and putting it online, but there was 2 issues about that. One is that broadband hadn't properly taken off, so you're still on dial-up, so you've still got very slow internet speeds, so it's difficult to see anything that had any kind of or anything that was a large file size, and also you only had kind of small screens to watch it on. So this stuff was being presented often sort of like a really high quality, but it wasn't finding an audience, and also it wasn't being sort of seen and experienced in a social setting. So the idea of Noise of Art was to take it from that environment and put it into gig spaces and gallery spaces and club spaces. So we started at the British Film Institute, which is on the South Bank in London, on the Thames, and we did a weekend where we took over the whole building and did clubs and music and film presentations. And then we did a night at the Tate Gallery, which is further up the Thames on the opposite bank, and took again. The reason why we had to wait for 3 years, we had to wait for a space where the gallery was being changed, so we had an empty building and we could use the whole gallery and turn it into one massive chill-out space upstairs and a nightclub downstairs. And we had over 5,000 people turn up, and it was phenomenally successful. So that's how we launched, and then since then I've worked with loads of galleries, in the UK and Europe, and lots of festivals, putting on music and different forms of art, and always trying to find a new form of art. So we began working with film and visual art and projections, and we've carried on doing that, but we've also added in things like architecture and textiles, and deliberately trying to find forms of art that are quite difficult to put into a musical spectrum, and therefore kind of presenting ourselves with challenges and overcoming them. Which brings us up to now, where we've done lots of things in galleries. We've done a few kind of exhibition type of things. We've done kind of pop-up exhibitions where people had to find bits of art, and then once they found them, they got some kind of reward. Sometimes it'd be taking a piece of art home with them or whatever it was. But we hadn't done a fixed exhibition until this year, when we decided we were going to do a history of French electronic music to coincide with, effectively 100 years since a guy called Luigi Russolo, who was an Italian futurist but conceived a future form of music in 1914 that he said would sound like the rhythms of the factory and machines and engine noises, and basically described electronic music. So he was injured in the First World War, and he had tried to play his new form of music in Milan, and it had caused a riot. But when he'd done it in Paris, the artistic community in Paris had welcomed it. So when he was injured in the First World War, he decided to move to Paris rather than go back to Italy. And because of the spread of cinema, he started soundtracking silent film with his early electronic music. So he took that as 100 years sort of beginning point for French electronic music, and then invited people to contribute pictures. We found archive pictures going back of Luigi Russolo and Varese and kind of important pioneers. And then we invited people to contribute pictures that they'd taken. Some of them were professional photographers, some of them were just people who were hanging out at raves. But the idea was to try and capture the things that happened because of the music. So we didn't want pictures of DJs, we didn't want pictures of people playing a gig, although we had some because they're exceptional pictures. But what we wanted was a group of mates getting ready to go out, or people adopting certain styles of clothing and fitting into certain cultures because they were associating themselves with that music. So I've actually, if you want to see, this is a picture of Luigi Russolo, who's the futurist I was telling you about, and I should be able to go through. I didn't want that one yet. This is like a proper presentation where everything goes wrong. This is a picture of a guy called Jean-Jacques Berger, who came along to the London exhibition, performed and spoke. This is him in 1970 playing an ARP early synthesizer. So he's one of the first people to play a synthesizer anywhere in the world live on stage, but was certainly one of the first in France. And they did that by basically having to sort of persuade venues that were in downtime to let them go in. So they actually got to play this really nice theatre for 5 days, but the reason why was that there was no other production going on, but traditional venues weren't kind of that interested in experimental electronic music back then. And this is a picture of a guy called Bernard Schechner, who invented the light harp that was then used by Jean-Michel Jarre. But he was a light artist, and again he began to get interested in electronic music. So this is back in the 70s, and then he recorded an electronic album in 1976, I think. And it's before there were any sequencers, so rather than use a sequencer to compose the music, he recorded a monophonic synthesizer into lots of different tape loops, and then tape looped the songs together. Let's see what else we got. There is a reason for this, I'll explain in a minute. This is a guy called Bernard Fevre, who's also called Black Devil Disco Club, and he produced an electronic disco record, again mid-70s. Like most of the early electronic musicians, he got his money by doing library music, so music for adverts and TV programs and films. But he released this as a single and it disappeared into the sandpit of time until it was found by Aphex Twin in a second-hand or a jumble sale, I think, in France. Or actually, I think it might have been Luc Vibert who found it, who then shared it with Aphex Twin. But they had one copy and they shared it between them in the office and when they were playing out. And gradually it started catching on again, and eventually they found him and they re-released it on Reflex. But then it's been picked up by Low Recordings in the UK now, and it's had a full re-release and stuff. So he's suddenly playing festivals and venues again, which is quite cool. And I've got here. This is probably my favourite picture in the whole exhibition, and the reason why, because it just speaks volume about the culture. This is in 1988-89, at the point where, well, obviously house has exploded, but also things like Run DMC has brought Adidas into fashion. And in France, I don't know why, but in that period you couldn't buy Dr. Martens, you had to buy them in London. So the trendiest thing to have was a pair of DMs, and the other trendiest thing to have was a pair of Adidas. So they got some sticking plaster and they stuck Adidas stripes on their DMs and went out to a rave. And this photographer, Olivier de Gours, happened to see them and like took a picture. But I love it because it just tells you, like, the picture's great, but then it gives you so much context as well. This is a picture of a rave in 1988 being busted in Paris. They used to amazingly hold that raves wherever they could find a space. So like the bridges going across the Seine would be used as a rave space, and inevitably get busted, of course. This picture is great. So it's one of the ones we blew up because it's a nice picture. And as you walked into the exhibition, it was at the end of the kind of approach on the opposite wall. And I was just standing by it, and a French friend walked in called Aude, who I hadn't seen for years, and I didn't know she was coming, so that was a surprise. And she was like, "Oh!" And then she stopped looking at me, started looking at that picture, and went, "Can I swear?" Well, fucking hell, I was there, right? And she starts going, "This is," and I can't remember the names, but this is like Vivienne, this is Jean-Claude. Anyway, she was at that rave, she got busted at this rave, so that was kind of cool as well. What else we got there? That's just another nice fashion picture. And these three guys, this is a guy called DJ Yellow, this is a guy called DJ Cam, and this is a guy called Chris Lefebvre. He ran Yellow Productions, which was actually a French hip-hop label, but also did house stuff, and they're all DJs. Cam was a kind of stayed, I think, the purest, like on the hip-hop side, but they all kind of indulged in other areas. And they were kind of in the period that MC Solar began sort of breaking and stuff. So they're kind of one of the hippest French labels. These two formed an outfit called Bob Sinclair together, and then did an exchange with Tom Bangalter from Daft Punk, and now DJ Yellow stopped being in Bob Sinclair because it went into a kind of more commercial direction that he was happy with. Chris carried on, and Bob Sinclair's now kind of international name, but this is when they were all starting out to go. Actually, they're already kind of established because they were touring in Tokyo, but this is kind of back in their start. So again, he came over and took part in the events in London, and then we did a panel in France as well, talking about stuff. And I'll just show you one more, because this is all supposed to be an illustration. This again is a picture by Olivier de Gosse, and there's two of them that go together. So this is in a DJ booth at a point when Daft Punk didn't like people taking their pictures. You know, since then they've developed the robot mask and stuff like that. But back then, they didn't like their faces appearing anywhere. But Olivia, being a mate, knew he could take their bums. So he took a picture of them playing in the DJ booth. And again, I really like these pictures because first you look at them and go, okay, that's a pair of jeans and someone's bum. But again, it's got a backstory that tells you a lot about what was going on. So anyway, the reason why I brought these pictures along was because the intention now is to make an exhibition about the transition period at the end of the communist era, at the beginning of the Velvet Revolution, and then what happened afterwards. And so we're inviting people to contribute photographs to that so that we can capture some of the kind of musical events that were happening during that period and some of the culture that went with that music. And the point of doing these things is kind of archiving bits of popular culture that otherwise tend to disappear. Quite often the music stays around, and iconic images of acts stay around, but the other popular ends of culture tend to disappear. So one is getting together an exhibition and putting some music events to go along with that, and having panels, discussions, and hopefully some films and things that give you a kind of sense of the culture from that period in Prague. And then we hopefully would do the exhibition here in Prague, and do it in London, and take it to some other places around Europe, and then eventually it'll be archived in the Tresor building in Berlin, along with the other exhibitions that we've done, and so it stays there as a kind of permanent record of images from that period. So we're kind of inviting people to get in contact and send any images through. And we hope maybe later on this year we'll do the first one in London, or do the first one here in Prague. But this is kind of the launch. So anyway, thanks for your time.